Yesterday I decided I want to study Indole because it is a interesting material and supposedly a challenging material, but it's also a popular one, and I wanted to know how it's used and why it is so loved in perfumery. So I did two tests, both containing three materials, and I did a thing where I first mixed the mixture without Indole, and then I added a little bit until it was too much, to see how much Indole is good, how much is too much, and also to compare to having no Indole at all to see what effect it does to the flower accords. In my understanding, Indole is like a flower realism element, which happens to sometimes remind people of feces, but it's not the worst one. I've tried worse materials that smell even worse. This one is uncomfortable, but it's not too gross, I would say, because it does remind of flowers. If I'm correct, then it's the jasmine. It helps to make more real, but it can be used in other flower accords as well. First, let me tell you how I did these experiments, and then I'm gonna show both of them. So what I did is I had three materials in each of these test samples, different materials. But what I did is I added the first two that are just flowery elements like Benzyl Salicylate, Hedione, Ethyl Linalool, and I first mixed the clean version without Indole, and I dipped the first strip. Then I added Indole, very small amount, and dipped again. And then I added Indole again, even more, and dipped another strip. For the A008 test, I did three examples, so one without Indole, one with 0.01 grams, and one with 0.02. And then for the other example, I did way more. I ended up with 7 paper strips with different amounts of Indole in them, and as high as 1.92%, so almost 2% of Indole. I was very surprised to see how even as little as 0.01 grams, which is like 0.06% relative usage in the formula, in the first formula, how that was enough to give this accord a realism. I was also surprised that in the second example, I could go as high as 2% of relative usage Indole in the formula, and it was still smelled good. Plus, it smelled even better than when I used very little amounts, but it's because I used different materials in the second bottle. Let's look at the first example. I did Benzyl Salicylate pure 0.12 grams, and I combined it with Hedione diluted to 10%, 0.5 grams. And finally, I added 1% Indole, that is Indole diluted to 1%, 0.01 grams, which in this example was 0.06% relative usage. That is less than 1%. And yes, I was pleasantly surprised how it smelled good. But then after I added another 0.01 grams, which raised the usage, relative usage for Indole to 0.12%, so twice as much, but still less than 1%. Suddenly it felt too much. It felt like I can smell only Indole. And my explanation is that because this formula is so clean and these flower materials are so clean that Indole it was overpowering them, even at this small percentage. But smelling the next morning, even the 0.02 grams of Indole was okay, and it didn't feel like too much. But it's probably because the other materials faded as well, and so that's more like the dry down of this thing. Now let's look at the second example. I combined Ethyl Linalool diluted to 10% with Hedione diluted to 10%, both at 0.4 grams, and then I added Indole again diluted to 1%, and I started by adding 0.10% relative usage of Indole, and I kept adding and smelling and making new test strips. I went from 0.10% to 0.20, 0.37, 0.58, and then 0.95% is when I started to feel Indole in this formula. And then when I went up to 1.44%, that's when I started to feel it even more. And I stopped at 1.92, so almost 2% relative usage of Indole in this formula. This is where I feel like I hit the sweet spot. I did not try to add more to go overboard because I already tried it with the other example, so I know what it feels like when Indole is too much. And yes, this is a very pleasant smell. I'm not good with flowers, so I don't know what is this jasmine or lily or whatever. But Ethyl Linalool and Hedione and Indole, it just smells like a real flower. Especially the next morning, if I smell this last test strip where I added almost 2% of Indole, it smells like a real flower. It smells like something I would smell in my kitchen on the table when there's flowers there. When somebody gives you a flower bouquet on your birthday, it just smells like, you cannot smell the Indole itself. It doesn't feel like you're smelling the material, which if you try, you're not gonna like it most likely. But when it's mixed with these flower materials, suddenly it feels so much more real, so much more premium. If I compare the version which had almost no Indole at all, so 0.1% relative usage, the difference is very big. Like, you could clearly see how Indole is making this formula better. In the example which does not have Indole, you can smell ethyl linalool so strong, it's like all you can smell. But then when you add Indole, suddenly the ethyl linalool isn't so bright. It's not screaming in your face. There's something that keeps it down, there's something that complements it very well, and that's the Indole doing its job. On the second hand, now when I smell this last example, the second day, it might be too much Indole, but I wouldn't go much lower than 1.80%. So it's still a lot of Indole in this blend. Although, I'm not sure. It might be the right amount, it's just there's no other materials, it's not a complete formula, complete perfume, so it feels a little out of place. But I think if this was in an actual perfume, this would be the right amount for this combination of materials. To summarize, Indole is a weird material that smells weird on its own and uncomfortable and unpleasant on its own. But if you use it in flower accords in very small amounts, as little as 0.06% relative usage, but can go as high as 2% or more maybe, it adds realism, it adds something that you just can't get without it. It adds life, it adds some kind of core, some kind of essence, some kind of weight that the flower accord needs to feel real and luxurious. I can clearly see why this material is so loved in perfumery, because it just does a very, very beautiful effect to flower accords. But yes, it is challenging because you need to find the right amount, and you don't know what the right amount is unless you've tried it many times and you've done many tests like this. So if you are making a flower accord, you have to start very small, because if your flower accord is like in the first example, it's very clean, then there's not much space for error, and you have to start very small and increase the amount of indole you use in this accord until you go too much overboard with it, and then you push back a little bit. That's how you would balance this. And this is what I did with the other example, is I started very small with the smallest amount I could add, and I kept adding and adding and adding until I hit a spot where I felt like this is the right amount. Another lesson is that indole can act differently in different contexts. So in one example you need very, very small amount, but it's still helpful. In another example, like the one with ethyl linalool and Hedione, you can add more. I'm not sure exactly why you can add more in this example, but well, it's a fact that you might need to add more in different contexts than in others. Something else that I learned from this example is I really solidified my understanding that if a material smells weird, it is not indicating that this material is bad. You just need to find the right context for it. Just like yesterday, I kept smelling ebano and it just smells so good compared to when I first got it. I did not like it at all, but now I keep smelling it and it's just so beautiful. I suggest that if you have indole and you have never used it, you don't know how to use it, try this. Try very simple flower accords and use indole in a very small relative percentage, and you will see how it adds this warmth, this premium feeling to these accords. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps.